Halloween night.
Pumpkinists, and finally welcome back to an actual educational video about our lovely Church of the Great Pumpkin. Today we'll be talking about the saints of Pumpkinism, whose chapters in the Holy Text were recently published about a month ago. And by published I mean put onto the Church of the Great Pumpkin.weebly.com website, where everybody can see it if they type in the full URL, churchofthegreatpumpkin.weebly.com. Also, in today's video, I will be changing outfits corresponding to the saint that I'm talking about. Currently, I'm in the Saint Edwina outfit just because I didn't want to wear a full outfit for the introduction. But yeah, that's the gist of today's video. Now, what are the saints of Pumpkinism? The saints of Pumpkinism are beings that are generally immortal and have magical powers and serve some purpose to help the figures in Church of the Great Pumpkin's holy text, such as the Great Pumpkin, Festiva, Spider, Vinia, and Earth. Besides that, there are no real credentials for being a saint of Pumpkinism. They are not necessarily alive, and they are not necessarily dead. Some of them used to be animals, and some of them used to be inanimate objects. Some of them used to be alive, and then died, and then came back in an undead form. Some of them were alive and never truly died, but are no longer truly alive. So really, it depends on each of their stories what necessarily being a saint means. But what we do know is that at some point along the way, they had a run-in with one of the accomplices, the Great Pumpkin, or Earth, or just a general event that turned them into an immortal being that assists these figures. All of the saint stories serve to teach us a lesson. Whether that lesson be something totally serious or a little more lighthearted, it really, like I said, depends on the saint. So without further ado, let's talk about the saints of Pumpkin. Hello, Pumpkanists. Let us now discuss the story of Saint Jack. Since you can probably tell by my current outfit, Saint Jack has the head of a pumpkin. Although I love this mask, it's very hard for me to talk in, especially given my current state, so we're going to take it off. Leo can wear him. Saint Jack's story begins, actually, in the very first tale about Festiva in the Holy Texts. In that tale, you may recall the Adaman, which was sort of like a human, but it was malformed and supernaturally created by the Great Pumpkin to be, well, his idea of a perfect being. However, the Adaman was rather selfish and quite awful. So Earth created a plan to get rid of him, and concocted the gourd and the things inside of it that would soon become Festiva, accomplice of war and conflict and love and winter, and all of that good stuff. In the possession of Jack, which was the Adaman's name, was an eternal fire that would always stay lit, and Earth convinced him to put it into smaller and smaller vesicles until it sort of just became normal fire. However, it still had that magical quality, and when he plunged it into the gourd, heeding Earth's advice, it sprung up and became Festiva, and then Festiva, taking revenge for what Jack had done to her mother's planet, burnt him to death and threw his body into the sky. But, as we know from this story, and from so many of its manner, there is always something that remains. And in this case, that thing that remained was the spirit of Jack, which was purely based off of fear. It simply held on to the fear of his final moments, and that's what kept him going for years and years. He still had his intelligence that he was given at the time of his creation, and so over time he just became angrier and more upset that Festiva, this person who had killed him and taken his holy eternal flame, was now riding free and in charge of winter and the skies and all of this that he thought he should have had instead. So Jack grew angrier and angrier until instead of fear, his entire person was made up of spite. He wore the visage of a naturally tall ghost with the head of a pumpkin lantern, very similar to the thing that brought down his own demise. And through the years, he stalked all three accomplices and learned their patterns and what they did at certain times. And he met them one day at the beginning of spring at their meeting place, which was the entrance and the realm in which Festiva force-fed the unworthy dead macaroni and beef chili. And there he attacked them in hopes to gain Festiva's eternal flame, which she carried with her everywhere. Now, if it was just Festiva he was fighting, he may have had more of a chance, but With all 3 accomplices after him, even if they weren't good at fighting, Vinny and Spider still caused a big enough obstacle that even if he gained the eternal flame, he was still not able to win. Festiva, of course, dealt the final blow with her terrifying mask of many, many eyes of all of the creatures she's killed, and he was subdued. Surprisingly enough, it was Spider who wanted to kill the terrible ghost-like being, but Festiva objected because it hadn't worked in the past and it wasn't likely it would work again. Vinia offered to imprison him for all of eternity, but again, they decided against it. Eventually, they all decided to rather make him into a servant for them, to do their dirty work, such as force-feed the unworthy dead, macaroni and beef chili. But as the ages wore on, the accomplices grew kinder and more fond of their odd thrall, and soon they became friends with him, and their friendship and love for him eventually turned his being that was only of spite and fear and this twisted, terrible emotion into something that was just purely himself. And he became a being of benevolence thanks to the friendship and love of his buddies, the accomplices. The story of Saint Jack teaches us not only of forgiveness, but also of the necessity of letting go of things in the past, of old grudges or pains that simply cause us to become these beings of spite or fear and hatred. It is much healthier for us to let go and grow from these times. St. Jack's past of violence and anger and basically his entire past obviously connects him to the accomplice of Festiva. Both his demise and her creation are the same story, and like I said, they both have this very intense anger about them, or used to have. In fact, of all of the accomplices, Jack is the closest with Festiva, and often helps her, as they bonded doing, force-feed the unworthy dead macaroni and beef chili. They also both used to hold the eternal flame, which is the oldest of any of the holy objects the accomplices hold, and is a symbol of power and is vitally important to the holy text. It's very interesting that both Festiva's creation and Jack's demise come from the same object. Jack's story also not only reminds us to let go, but also tells us of the redeeming power of just having people there who enjoy you and believe in you. So Jack's story also tells us to appreciate our friends and the people in our lives who make us feel like we're more than just beings of anger and spite and fear and sorrow and hatred. Such is the tale of Saint Jack.
But there's a full moon rising. Let's go dancing in the light.
As I mentioned before, I am in the Edwina outfit, so let's talk about Saint Edwina. Saint Edwina is the guardian and protector of the last patch and resides in the corn maze that surrounds it. Her story details how she came to be there. Edwina was a young pumpkinist around the time that Vinia died, and in the migration that most of the pumpkinists at the time had, where they came to live in the last patch with Vinia, Edwina got lost along the way in that journey and ended up at the house of an old wise woman who worshipped many gods, including the Great Pumpkin, and practiced a strange form of folk magic or witchcraft. From that woman, Edwina learned this witchcraft. She learned to cook and do other necessary things, and she also learned the art of map making. As she grew into adulthood, Edwina wanted to return to her old family and friends, the Pumpkanists, and asked the old witch woman if she knew the way to the last patch. The old witch woman told her and sent her on her way, and Edwina ended up walking through the cold and storm for many, many miles, through uncharted land, the undiscovered country, until she came to the entrance of the last patch, which was, of course, a corn maze. So she entered, but as the days, the months, the years passed by, she found there was no exit. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't find one. She started to meticulously map out the entire corn maze until she had all of it on paper except for a few corners, which she assumed must be the exits and entrances that she was no longer allowed to go through. Then she started to find the souls of the Pumpkanists who needed to journey through the corn maze and find their way into the last patch. So by guiding them, she realized that she could not enter the last patch because she was not dead, but she could not leave the corn maze that surrounds it because she was not living anymore either. She was in between, in some sort of limbo between life and death, and that's where she stays to this day, in the corn maze surrounding the last patch, guiding Pumpkinist souls to and from, and keeping whatever vile things want to get in out. I also like to think, personally, because I like to think positively whenever I can, that on the Halloween, when the veils between our world and the last patch and all of the other strange places are thinner, maybe Edwina can sneak her way into the last patch and spend some time with her old friends and family and new friends and family and Vinia herself, along with, of course, the Great Pumpkin and Earth. What Edwina represents is the value of serving others and helping others, no matter what our circumstances are. She also represents guidance and, again, helping others, which is mainly what she does for her entire immortal life. Of course, Edwina also has ties to things like cooking and folk magic and all that kind of fun stuff, as well as more pastoral things like corn mazes, corn, crops, etc. This sort of links her to Spider, as he is the accomplice that mostly represents things like prosperity and abundance and these sort of things. She also ties into Spider with her connection to map making and journeys, both of which she ends up doing a whole lot, as Spider is, of course, the accomplice of travel and adventure. Edwina reminds us that no matter what our own circumstances are, and even if we're stuck in a hard place like she perpetually is, we can always do something to help the others and the people in our life who may need it a little bit. She also represents showing guidance to others. Even if you don't truly know what you're talking about, it's always nice to help a friend in need. Let us now discuss the most recent addition to the Church of the Great Pumpkin Saints, the Grounded One. I don't have a brown cloak, but I covered my chair here in this fun little blanket. Before we get into the story, I'd just like to say that I'll link the video in the description, but this story is told much more eloquently and in a much longer version by our keeper Jackrabbit in the video The Grounded One. The Grounded One as a saint started off as simply a bear. This bear hunted in the wilderness and caught the attention of Festiva, who added it to her demon hunt. Now, once it was in Festiva's demon hunt, it hung around her. She had obviously liked the bear enough to add it to the demon hunt, and she also liked it enough to keep it close to her at most of the time, and it started to absorb her power, and once it got a taste of that power, it's pretty obviously going to want more. And so it did, and it wanted more and more, and it kept taking until it weakened Festiva to the point where, come the winter solstice, she was not able to take to the skies, and the bear took over instead, and winter reigned for a long, long time. Spider, soon realizing that this was not how things normally were and went to investigate, found Festiva's broken and crumpled body and used almost all of his power to give her power to rise again, pull the world out of winter, and get rid of this terrible bear. So Spider drained all of his power into Festiva, and she pulled Vinia and the Great Pumpkin and Earth out of their hibernation, and then she went after the bear, who was hunting. The bear, though strong, obviously could not stand a chance against Festiva herself, and she brought its broken corpse back to the last patch, where Vinia took it and offered to care for it and asked Festiva to leave it to her. Festiva did this, although she really didn't like it, and Vinia brought the bear back to life and started nursing it back to health. Both Festiva and Spider were quite upset with this, as this bear literally almost killed their entire family, and also it was just a bear, which is something you have to keep in mind in this whole story, that though it has this hunger for power, it may not have had malicious intent because it's just a bear, and bears are animals that have more base urges than humans do most of the time. One night, Festiva snuck into the chamber in which the bear was held, where Vinia was sleeping, and attempted to kill it. However, Vinia woke up in time to stop her and covered the entire bear in a blanket of vines. Then, she turned the bear into a human man. She once more scolds Festiva for trying to kill it and asks her, "Pretty please, don't kill it, I told you to leave this up to me." And Festiva leaves after the human man apologizes the only way he really knows how to at this point. Then Vinia gives this man the task of wandering the world through all of time and caring for the Earth, and being her sort of agent on Earth during winter when she is dormant in the ground. And so that's what the Grounded One does to this day. He wanders the Earth no matter the season, taking care of it and tending to its needs even when Vinia and her mother cannot. Obviously, the story of the Grounded One is a cautionary tale about pride and greed and hubris and, well, being ungrounded and taking more than we need and more than any person should have. It also represents the moral forgiveness and giving people the benefit of the doubt when it comes to the ways that people very much can change and become something better. The Grounded One went from being something that destroyed the Earth and plunged it into an endless winter to the thing that cares for the earth through the winter and ensures that it comes back every spring. Though I know it can be complicated in a lot of situations saying that people can change, but in most mundane ones we have to accept the fact that people aren't going to stay bad forever. It is Vinya's forgiveness and willingness to help the Grounded One become better that turns him into what he is today, which is someone that benefits all of the accomplices. Obviously, the accomplice that the Grounded One would most likely be associated with is Vinya, because, well, she created the Grounded One in his form today. Although he was rather close to Festiva as a bear, he tried to kill her, and that doesn't really make him a saint associated with her so much as he is associated with Vinya, who turned him into a person and cared for him and basically believed in him and helped him turn into what he is today. Another thing that connects the two is that every year Vinya is reborn from the earth and from when she died in the fall. The Grounded One is reborn after he is killed as a bear by Festiva and turned into a human by Vinya. His rebirth is not so much a physical one, although it literally is, as much as a mental one, where he's still very much the same bear that he used to be, but now he has learned and he has grown and he's been basically reborn into something that assists the figures of Pumpkanism rather than hinders them. Basically, the story of the Grounded One and the Grounded One himself tells us that we can't get caught up in things like greed and pride, and we must always be careful of the needs of others, and also that forgiveness and giving people the benefit of the doubt are hugely important, especially when you're dealing with bears. Trying to put this on my head so that it does not mess up my glorious face paint. So without further ado, let's talk about Saint Jimothin. Saint Jimothin was initially an inanimate object. He was a plastic Halloween skeleton from the well-known Halloween store Spirit Halloween. However, Saint Jimothin was, well, out well before it was his time to be out and sort of floating around in the yard of one young girl in early summer. And so, she and her friend were rather misguided in their attempts to please the Great Pumpkin and sacrificed him brutally and terribly. Saint Jimothin was thrown from off of a roof that was rather high and dashed upon the driveway below. Then, he was covered in a shroud and beat repetitively with a baseball bat made of plastic. And then, just when the poor skeleton's body could not catch a single break, they strung his scattered limbs onto one long rope and then passed him in between their houses, hiding them in their houses or yards all summer long. Until one day, the Great Pumpkin, who had not been paying much attention, finally heard their cries of sacrifice, well, several months late, and decided to take pity on the poor Saint Jimothin and turn him into a saint, rebuilding his poor, broken plastic body. Now, Saint Jimothin wanders as a saint of fun and whimsy, and spooky shenanigans all year long. He also completely disappeared from the yards of the two girls. Neither one knows where he is currently, which is because he's now a saint and wandering the earth on his own. As you may know, in some religions, mostly Catholicism, there are artifacts corresponding to saints. We actually have one for Saint Jimothin. It's right here in my most favorite little shrine. Here we have the jaw of Saint Jimothin. Rescued from his body before he was turned. As you can see, it is severed from the rest of him. But we now have this holy relic we can use whenever we wish to honor Saint Jimothin. Now, given Saint Jimothin's manner of becoming a saint and basically the story of his kind of life, and due to the fact that he's a skeleton, we can easily connect him to the idea of the memento mori. A memento mori is an object, but mostly just a saying, that represents the fact, or simply says the fact, that we will all die someday. It basically says, remember you will die. I've actually made a couple memento moris because I've taken that quite to heart. Now, it's not meant to be some kind of morbid, gothy death thing. It's meant to be a reminder that because you will someday die, you should live your life to the fullest, like we say in Church of the Great Pumpkin. Live for life. St. Jimothy reminds us that we only live one very short, very fleeting life, and the nature of all happiness is ephemeral, so we should do our best to enjoy the things we have, and to love the people around us, and to simply live our lives to what seems to be the fullest, and make our life decisions not based off of what might come after, which for some of us could mean going to the last patch, or in the case of St. Jimothy, could mean becoming a saint of Pumpkanism. We should live our lives to the fullest as we have them because there is no guarantee of the afterlife. St. Jimothy is also obviously a symbol of death, but unlike, say, Vinia, whose death is taken as very seriously and represents the changing seasons, St. Jimothy's sort of death symbolism is very different, and like I said, he's more of a memento mori type of person. So although the saint he would most likely correlate to is Vinia, their sort of symbology on death is very different. Vinia's symbology on death represents fall and the death of the earth, but also the fact that come spring the earth rises again. Vinia's symbology on death has a lot to do with rebirth and renewal. However, St. Jimothy's sort of take on death is less about the renewal and more about the life you have currently, and the fact that for most of us there might not be anything after death, and we don't know if there's anything after death, and for all of us death is very final, and it is our end, which we would do well to remember living our everyday lives, as St. Jimothy reminds us. St. Jimothy also represents fun, and much unlike the other saints, he doesn't have a big lesson we can be taught other than basically the most important lesson, which is to live your life to the fullest. St. Jimothy lacks the seriousness of the other saints, but his message is no less important. St. Jimothy reminds us to have fun and enjoy the people and places and basically the entirety of life around us while we can. And that is what I think the most beautiful thing about this very odd little plastic skeleton saints that we have.